Welcome back. You are watching and listening to Breakfast with Ellie and Nicholas. The time has just gone 7:35.
Indeed. Now, we've been asking for your views this morning, and my goodness, have we been getting them. Loads and loads of them. Obviously about Prince Harry. But let's start. The winter crisis in the NHS, provoking a lot of you to get in touch. Richard says this: unfortunately, I think there'll come a time when the NHS is no longer a free provision. Individuals need to be responsible for their own health costs, as the taxpayer cannot afford free public health for everyone.
That's a point, yep.
And Sally here says, I would argue the government seems to have buried their heads in the sand over addressing the internal problems associated with the NHS, and we're now paying the price. And John says, throwing money at the NHS and expecting improvements is pointless. This culture is wasteful. The NHS doesn't and won't work under Conservative leadership.
Lots of you as well getting in touch on Prince Harry, of course, this morning. Steve says, I'm also a veteran of war. I too wish he would go away. He is just a crybaby. And Jason says, I wouldn't talk to that man if he knocked on my door and tried to sell me his book personally. As a veteran, I feel he has broken a code that only a soldier would know. And Leon said, good morning, Ellie and Nicholas. In my opinion, Meghan has designs on the American presidency, and Harry has given her access to the top table. But I do predict that if Harry loses public support, he may too lose his wife. And I think you made a really good point about that earlier with there's actually no Meghan Markle in this picture. It is just the Harry show. The focus is solely on Harry, which we haven't really seen a lot in the past few years.
We haven't.
And I wonder what Meghan Markle makes of that.
Indeed. Leon touches on that, said, good morning, Ellie and Nicholas. In my opinion...
We just read that one, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, you did read that one. Yes, I'm awfully sorry. We've got so many messages here. We're trying to flip through to see what people have, what people are saying. Jim says, I think this sums up what an awful lot of people think. I'm sick of hearing about the woes of this mega-rich couple and their pathetic hurt feelings. Americans are obsessed... This is Meghan, Americans are obsessed with hurt feelings. We hopefully have the old, stiff upper lip.
Yes, well, do keep your views coming in. I cannot tell you how many we've got. I've got a nice one about Nicholas, actually. We'll end with that one, shall we, before we look in the papers. It's a lovely one about you. This is from Stephanie. Good morning, Stephanie, who says, Dear Nicholas, I sent you a fax on the day that you were reporting on Diana's funeral, because Nicholas himself is a royal correspondent, have been a royal correspondent in your time. And Stephanie says, you replied to her. She just wants to say thank you. And also, please remember that both of Harry's parents have published books. So
yes.
Perhaps,
good point.
That's a really good point to make. Keep them coming in. We've got so many of them. gbviews@gbnews.uk.
But it's time now to go and have a look at the newspapers. Joining us this morning is the editor of Spike, Tom Slater, and the anthropologist, Mary Ann O'Hotter. Well, shall we start with you, Mary Ann? This is going away from Harry, which we would rather like to do because we don't want to get everyone too tired of it. This is a story...
Yeah, we're not going to talk about any Harry stories.
No Harry stories at all. Is that a promise?
Harry free zone.
I have your promise. So that's great.
Absolutely.
But this one in the mail about plastic, a ban on plastic. What's this all about? It's not the first time we've heard that phrase, ban on plastic, of course.
No, so this is single-use plastic. This is the Environment Secretary, Therese Coffey, who is set to outlaw certain single-use plastic items by the end of the year. There are certain qualifiers to that grand announcement, which would fundamentally be very, very good for our environment. You know, those things like plastic plates, cutlery, certain types of food containers. You know, they're used for a few minutes, probably. You know, you drink your coffee and then you chuck it, and then it lasts for 500 odd years. And when it finally does break down, it doesn't disintegrate and biodegrade back into the environment and no trace is left. It actually just becomes microplastics, which is fundamentally very bad for us as well. You know, we found them in the placentas of pregnant women. We found them in the blood systems of unborn babies. There's an association with the increasing rates of cancer and us literally having microplastics in our body, let alone what it's doing to the environment more broadly. So this is Therese Coffey, actually following through on some of the government's commitments. Currently, 608 million single-use plates are used in England alone every year. 608 million. So what these new rules will ban, and the Mail on Sunday is celebrating this because this was a campaign that they've run to reduce single-use plastic, to ban plastic straws, things like that. But it won't, so it'll cover single-use plastic in places like cafes where you sit down to eat, so eat in situations, but it excludes regulations for takeaway and sort of delivery food.
So there's always compromise, and in the end, you still got a massive problem, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. And fundamentally, when we look at the alternatives to these single-use plastics, we look at single-use something else's. So it might be a bamboo fibre coffee cup, or some kind of plate that's made of, I don't know, hemp fibre and recycled paper. But fundamentally, we can't really recycle our way out of this crisis because it's still really resource intensive. It's energy intensive, it's water intensive. We have to actually reuse things so that you're not throwing them away and having to recycle them again anyway. So banning single-use plastic, fantastic, can't come soon enough. The new rules will be enacted from October, so it'll give businesses a chance to kind of catch up with themselves and get the stuff that they need in place. But fundamentally, we need to stop. Take your mug with you.
Right.
Lots of places are doing it already, though, aren't they? I couldn't tell you the last time I had a plastic straw in a pub.
Oh yes, that's illegal.
Oh,
yeah,
well,
plastic straws
yeah.
are illegal.
But even when you get takeaway food, mainly now, maybe it's just places I go to, but it is in recyclable containers and things like that.
Yeah, but that's the problem. It sort of becomes a bit of a greenwash. It's a step in the right direction, but it doesn't resolve the issue because you go, oh well, it's all right, and so I'll just have 7 different takeaway coffees today. But that isn't sustainable. I mean, we're on a hiding to nothing if we carry on down that road.
Thank you, Marianne. Right, Tom, let's go to you, shall we now? And inflated grades will make students fail university, says The Telegraph.
Yes, this is a story about the kind of knock-on effect from the decision to close schools and cancel exams, primarily during the pandemic. So a lot of university leaders are pointing out that because of that grade inflation that we saw in 2021 in particular, points out, this is such a striking statistic, but 44.8% of all A-level grades were A or A stars in 2021 because there was this reversion back. 44.8%. Because of the fact that we all remember the algorithm which went horrendously wrong, one of Gavin Williamson's exploits, and then they had to kind of revert back to teacher-assessed grades, which for obvious reasons were quite a lot more generous. And whilst you obviously wouldn't begrudge the teachers of that, it obviously has these knock-on effects. So first of all, there was this scramble to actually find university places for people, given the knock-on effects of that, but also students are showing up at often top-flight universities just not kind of necessarily ready for it. And this is always a problem when you kind of push people into kind of those educational settings without actually having met the sort of requirements, if you like, formally, or they met them formally, but not actually education, is that you often get people dropping out, falling behind. It doesn't really work. So this is another thing that we're still sort of reckoning with. The grade inflation has come down as of last year. I think it went down to about 36.4% was A and A stars, but that's still at a very high level. And it's just a reminder of all of the kind of unintended consequences of a lot of the decisions that were made. And I think there's always going to be a very embittered, in some cases, debate about the lockdown measures, but I do hope going forward that the schools part of this and the exams part of this will be recognised as a mistake that we should have caught very early on, because even when during the period of the first lockdown, it became quite clear from countries that hadn't closed schools. Even I think in Sweden there was a study that came out comparing it to its neighbours that had closed their schools. In Sweden they only closed the sixth forms essentially, that it hadn't really made any impact in relation to spread.
And always talks about Sweden.
Exactly, but that was the sort of thing where even relatively early on it was quite clear that the schools part of this was most likely a mistake. And I think at least our bar for when we decided to do things like cancel exams should have been higher than probably it was, but of course in that moment of panic a lot of those things go out the window, don't they?
But also these students are going to be ill prepared for exams, aren't they? Because some of them have not sat an exam in school due to lockdowns. They just did coursework and it was a teacher assessment that got them through to university. They won't be prepared for that kind of assessment process once they're there, will they?
And the issue is as well is that this kind of is an extra layer on top of what was already going on, because grade inflation has been something that's been talked about for a fair amount of time. And there is this issue where you do have some students showing up at university where, particularly if they end up getting into top flight universities, where because the education they might have received was not kind of sufficient, they might have got the grades but not the education, if you like, that they do end up struggling, falling behind. There's often been kind of anecdotes of having to put on kind of more remedial courses and things for new entrants, and it's just not a good system to be in. It's not a knock on the teachers, it's not a knock on the individual students, but when the education system fails in that sense, you can set up even quite bright young kids for failure because they're just not prepared for that institution that they end up in at the end of it.
But I do think there's responsibility on the university's part to sort of take their share of the job of helping these young people get up to speed so that they can make the most of those educational opportunities and the kind of world of work and opportunities beyond there. Because we can't just kind of throw our hands up and go, oh, well, that's the lost generation. They didn't get the education they needed. They've got these kind of slightly dubious grades. We owe them, as a society, we owe them a responsibility to make sure that COVID doesn't impact their life chances for the rest of their lives. I think universities should put on remedial courses and study support and all that stuff.
I guess the point was they were doing that even before the pandemic in certain cases, and it's just the way in which this has sort of accelerated a lot of problems. And we're talking about university entrance here, but at the bottom end of the scale, you've got all of those children who just never returned to school, the so-called ghost children, who have just fallen off the educational map entirely. And
they're measured in thousands, aren't they?
Exactly. Just haven't returned back, and that's not only that's an educational horror, but it's also a safeguarding problem as well. So all of these things will be reckoning with for years to come. Definitely.
Right. Marianne, let's move on to something else. Ageism at work here when it comes to renting cars or trying to. This is Sunday People story.
Yeah, so this is traditionally a weekend where lots of people are planning their holidays away for later in the year. And this is a warning from Which, the consumer group, saying that there are some car hire companies that are excluding drivers who are over 75 years old, basically because of their age, which is illegal under equality law. So drivers are being urged to take car rental firms to court if they're turned away because of their age, because it shouldn't be happening. A company has to show objective justification for refusing to rent you a car.
Look at your driving record or something like that, or if you've got convictions on your licence, I guess.
Exactly, something like that. Or if you haven't renewed your licence under the kind of medical directions for people who are older. But fundamentally, insurance costs can be a lot higher. There might be additional restrictions to what you can hire or the costs associated, and then look at the small print. So Which is urging drivers to shop around, and there's also that kind of advice to know your rights so that you can contest that. Not necessarily the thing you want to be doing on the first day of your holiday when you're standing at the car rental desk, but I guess the more people know about this, the more they know that it isn't allowed, perhaps the less car companies are going to be trying to do it in the first place.
There's a lot of competition out there. There's a lot of car rental companies. I mean, the thing to do is just to sort of boycott the ones who behave like that and go on to someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And it does say in the article that the kind of the larger car rental companies don't have these discriminatory practices, and the group Saga says that if you're a member, they have discount schemes with some car rental companies.
But talking about the consequences of lockdown, bring us on to that previous conversation, this is actually one of them, and those car hire companies, many of them during lockdowns actually sold much of their fleet of cars. They simply weren't obviously being hired out, and the cost of renting a car, I don't know if anyone's
huge
tried to do it recently,
it's
absolutely through the roof.
Yeah.
That's just another thing, isn't it, that you wouldn't think. Okay, Tom, let's stay with COVID, shall we? And return of COVID measures won't work. Yeah, that wasn't intentional, but it worked in the Express.
Yes, so as many people might have noticed, there has been a sort of clamour for some return of COVID measures, whether that's kind of strong advice rather than anything too actually kind of coercive at this point. But there are experts who are kind of pushing back on the idea of whether or not this would be necessary. So there has been some discussion in recent days about, again, kind of return to masks on public transport, socially distancing, people working from home and so on. But many people have sort of... What's been interesting is that even the kind of view of government advisors that you see reported is that those things aren't necessarily going to work. Publicly, they'll say things like, obviously, if you're ill, don't go into the office. I think that's pretty good common sense advice anyway. But as ever, there's always when people see the pressure that's on the health service, there is a clamour for a kind of return to those measures. But just kind of pointing out that at this particular point, if we're not going to put those things behind us, then we never really will. That we do, as a kind of have to get back to normal life. And also, as some of these experts pointed out, viruses and things do need to circulate. Obviously, when it's a novel virus in which many people are exposed to, you don't want it to circulate. But in a situation where there is immunity in the population, whatever you do, that does have to happen.
And that's what we're seeing at the moment, aren't we, with the twindemic in the NHS. Marianne, Tom, I'm afraid that's time. But thank you very much, and you're back with us in the next hour, aren't you?